Thank you everyone for joining us, and also the people who keep joining us at this minute, this evening at the Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum for what is a very timely discussion on the state of Libya's current affairs. And we have an absolutely fantastic panel lined up for you, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank all of you, all of our panelists today, for agreeing to join us and share your expertise with us. Joining us this evening is Dr. Rana Jawad. Dr. Jawad is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath, as well as the co-founder and now convener of the MENA Social Policy Network, which is the world's only research and knowledge exchange grouping of its kind. Rana's main research interests are in the social policies and the welfare systems of the Middle East and North Africa, with an emphasis on the Arab and Muslim populations living there. Also here with us this evening is Mustafa Sagezli, General Manager of the Libyan Program for Reintegration and Development. Mr. Sagezli was Deputy Minister of the Interior in Libya's transitional government and the founding director of the Warriors Affairs Commission since October 2011. Chairing the discussion is Ambassador Peter Millett, who was British Ambassador to Libya from July 2015 until January 2018. He has served in a number of positions in the British diplomatic service, including an ambassadorial posting to Jordan, High Commissioner to Cyprus, as well as Director of Security in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office until 2005. And you will notice that who's not here with us this evening is Imad Badi. Unfortunately, due to a last-minute engagement, Imad had to drop out, but we are nonetheless very, very lucky to have Mr. Anas Al-Gomati joining us from Libya. Anas is the founder and current Director General of the Tripoli-based SADC Institute, which is the first public policy think tank in Libya's history, established in 2011. The SADC Institute conducts research across the east, west, and south of Libya, which is also unique in its own right. He has held several positions in the region and in Europe as a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and visiting lecturer at the NATO Defense College in Rome in Italy, and is a regular frequent commentator on Libyan and Middle Eastern affairs. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. And as always, we would start with individual remarks addressing the topic at hand. So I will hand over to Anas to begin the panel.
I'm going to just check quickly. Does Peter not want to give a quick introduction, or do you want me to go straight in?
We would go straight into your individual remarks, and I think Peter will begin at the moderated discussion part after that.
Well,
thank you.
Just thank you for kindly hosting us today, to MENAF, Cambridge MENAF, and to the co-panelists, to Peter for helping organize this as well, and also to the attendees for making time this evening. So I think it's, it is a timely discussion. There's so much going on in the world today, and it's easy to kind of lose sight of the multiple front lines of all of these different battles and different crises. But I mean, I think in Libya's case, this has been a slow-moving disaster. I've often called it like watching a car crash in slow motion, unfortunately, because when you're picking through the debris of the latest crisis, you see fragments from different, unfortunately to use the term, explosions or different car crashes over the last several years. And so when one has to ask today, how do you characterize today's crisis? It's actually quite a good question. It's often the simplest questions that we don't ask that allow us to really understand where we are, because you can begin asking yourself, if today's crisis with two rival governments today in Libya, is that a reality or a product of the failure to have elections? Is the failure to have elections a product of the failure of the last UN mediation that began in 2020? And I think that's probably a better place to kind of pick things up from. So just to paint the scene here, and start in January 2020, just a few months before the beginning of the global pandemic, world leaders met in Berlin. They met in Berlin at the UN-convened Berlin conference to end the civil war, or essentially the attack on Libya's capital by Khalifa Haftar, the leader of the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, who was trying at the time to overthrow the government of national accord, the UN-backed government. And fairly run-of-the-mill power grab and coup. What was interesting about this is that the UN itself had brought to life this government of national accord. And regretfully at the time, the UN Security Council failed. I mean, Antonio Guterres, the UN Security Chief, was in Tripoli at the time when Khalifa Haftar's forces attacked the capital. and failed to leave the country with any sense of trust or guarantees that they would look to end the crisis or look to end this conflict. And regretfully, it turned out in later weeks that we found out that members of the UN Security Council themselves were participating or giving green lights to that, to that onslaught on Tripoli. Now, why is that interesting and why is that relevant today? The interesting aspect outside of Libya is the UN Security Council, as we know today, is divided, and the world has gone from being a bipolar division at some stage in the last 30 years to now being multipolar. Or almost apolar. There is no more poles left inside the UN Security Council. There are so many different divisions and dichotomies that one can paint that it's difficult to understand the way that they can bring an end to these kind of conflicts. And again, the relevance of that, as we see today in Ukraine, shows how there is already a linkage in the international system between Libya and Ukraine. And I'll get into the more on the ground facts as to why that is. But essentially, it went from April 2019 until January 2020 when we began the UN Berlin process. Very, very simple, to not go into too much detail here. But essentially there was an agreement, a gentleman's agreement then to end the conflict and to bring the two rival political administrations, economic institutions and military factions and bind them, unify them essentially into one singular state, and to end that process with elections to give Libyans a fresh slate, a fresh political slate so they can elect political representatives that reflect the sentiment on the ground, but also that they preside over institutions that they can control. And that sounds fairly rudimentary and run-of-the-mill. It took a lot longer than we anticipated. In fact, the ceasefire broke after January 2020 and began again during the pandemic. It intensified, but it culminated with a stalemate in May 2020. And then in October 2020, a formalized ceasefire agreement in the city of Sirte, dividing East from West Libya. And since that time, we had the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which was the beginning of the political track to unify the two rival administrations into a single unity government. That was essentially completed in March 2021 with the establishment of the Government of National Unity, led by President Mohammed al-Menafi and a presidential council of 3 members, and Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibeh. That gives you an idea of who the main actors are today, and at least a little bit about the political process. So why have I started in January 2020 when we're today in March 2022? Because again, the history is important here. The Berlin process has been completely forgotten about. It's as if that didn't exist. It's as if there was no civil war. It's as if there were no rival administrations. And it's as if that the political process has just dissipated, because in March 2021, we had the establishment of this unified government with the promise of elections by December 24th, 2021, and that was announced during the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum in Tunisia. And it was, I think, this aspect of the political track that became the Achilles heel that unraveled both the political process itself, but also the broader state building process that began in 2020. And there's a good reason for that. Number one, once you've set a date in stone for one aspect of the transition, then all of the other aspects, the military tracks and the economic tracks, could just be left to drift and sleepwalk. And that's what's happened. The military factions have made no attempts and I won't go into too much of that because I know Mustafa will talk a bit more about and can give much more detail than I can about that portfolio. But just to give you a semblance of it, there is no movement, there is no goodwill, and there's no good faith on either side now to unify. And I suspect there's good reasons for that. And the second aspect, economically, there has been some symbolic reconciliation. There's been a unification of the board of the central bank. But there are many outstanding issues with Russian dinars that were printed several years ago. So rival currencies in the country that haven't been reconciled, auditing of the central banks that haven't been reconciled. And then on top of that now, you've had the lapse of the 24th of December elections and the unraveling in very peculiar terms. And the reason why I wanted to mention all of the military and economic aspects and the war that began in 2019 is because today's rival government is presided by Fathi Bashagha, the former Minister of Interior, who in 2019 was quote unquote the West's strongman, in parallel to the Eastern strongman Khalifa Haftar. These two enemies at the time had fought against one another, or on paper looked like they were fighting against each other, and it looked like they had irreconcilable differences. 2 years later, they're now buddy, and they've established a new government, the government of I think it's called National Stability, But essentially that new government is a really interesting elite bargain, and is being presented as a Libya agreement. And that came right after the failure of the elections. Now, again, we could start a little bit earlier on to understand why the elections failed. And in a 60-second summary, if you'll let me, then what I'll say about the elections is that after the establishment of the government of national unity, the GNU went to the east of Libya, met the parliament. There was much talk about an inability to establish a budget, a national budget. It was apparently over bloated. There are all of these on the paper reasons as to why the parliament had fell out with the government of national unity. But there was a member of the HOR in the parliament who offered really candid remarks in the first session when Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeiba was in Tobruk, and said, let me tell you the real reasons that you're here. We want to know about whether or not you're going to give us control of the Ministry of Defense position. And we also want to know about the budget for the Libyan Arab Armed Forces. And if you don't agree with those two things for us, then you're essentially wasting our time and wasting your own time. They failed to agree on that. And since then, really began the weaponization of the election track. Agel Saleh, the head of the parliament, a key ally of Khalifa Haftar, essentially Khalifa Haftar's political representative in the parliament, established his own electoral law by decree in September, essentially tailoring the presidential elections to fit the candidacy of individuals like Khalifa Haftar. That was done by decree. It wasn't done through a parliamentary vote with the House of Representatives. It wasn't done alongside the High State Council, Libya's consultative parliament in the West. And so essentially you began this kind of law by decree and spoiling of the political process. And regretfully, Libya's last SRSG, Jan Kubish, just accepted it as a fait accompli in order to expedite the process towards elections. And since then, the unraveling essentially began. On the 24th of December, when we didn't have elections, Libya's Higher National Electoral Committee chief, Imad al-Sayyah, went to the parliament and said, you have a failure to allow, you have a failure in the election law. You've got a technical failure in the ability to adjudicate between which characters can stand for presidential elections and which can't. Is it our committee's ability to decide and determine that result, or is it the Libya's court system? And essentially gave them a technical breakdown as to what they would need to do in order to be able to hold elections within 1 month. Now, the parliament's response was to ignore all of that and establish a rival government. And that tells you a little bit more about why what's happening is essentially, or rather what is driving all of these different political developments. The weaponization of the election process, in a nutshell, is because Libya's parliament chief, Agel Saleh, does not want parliamentary elections. He wants presidential elections tailored under conditions where they wouldn't be free and fair, if we're being quite honest and frank, under conditions that even by Amnesty International standards, Human Rights Watch standards, by almost any layman standards, with presidential candidates being attacked in east of Libya, such as Ismail Shtawi a few months ago, whereas Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi's legal team was attacked in the south of the country, whereby it's almost a given that the ballot box would be tampered with and would be stuffed across much of the country, including Western Libya. But then also for very obvious reasons. A presidential system is a winner-takes-all vote. And I think under the current circumstances, a zero-sum result like that would just pretty much spark war. And then finally, on the social level, in the absence of a constitution and in light of developments that have taken place in Tunisia with its own constitutional process here and the violation of the constitution, Libyans were concerned about the constitution and a lack of a constitution and began to demand across the board in low-level protests across the country that they would not like to see presidential elections before a constitution. The HOR, the parliament, has rejected or just ignored all of that and instead established this government of national stability, pretty much because they couldn't get control of the critical institutions and posts that matter. And the first is the presidency, because the presidency is not what we would normally term it to be in the West. The most charismatic character or political character, in your country, an individual who reflects the political sentiment of your population. That's all and well, and that may be true in the West, but in the Eastern context or in Libya's context, You have to read the fine print of what those positions are. And the fine print is that the president is really a military role. It's the supreme commander of the armed forces, and it has been the key prize for Khalifa Haftar and Aghala Saleh since they began negotiating control of that post since 2017. First in Paris and Abu Dhabi, and then Palermo, and then again in Abu Dhabi, and then 3 months later they started a war in order to take control of that post. And then that culminated again with an attempt to do so with this election law in September 2021. But again, you have to read your history and you have to look at the fine print, but that's a battlefront that has been raging for at least 5 years. The second aspect, again, is what that member of parliament said about the Minister of Defense position. And why that's interesting and relevant is that the Minister of Defense position has gone to a key ally, the brother, in fact, I believe, of a member of the House of Representatives, or a member himself, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But essentially, according to most insiders that were and analysts that have looked at this, that position was essentially given by proxy to Khalifa Haftar. The Minister of Finance and Planning posts have been unified under Fathi Bashar's cabinet, and that position also has been given to a sympathizer and an ally of the Libyan Arab Armed Forces. So essentially what's happened here is that those three key posts, and we can leave the presidential one for a moment because there's a caveat, Aghala Saleh, despite the fact that there is a president of the Government of National Unity, Mohammed al-Menafi, when they brought that government into existence in March 2021, Aghala Saleh failed to pass a constitutional amendment and essentially failed to transfer the post of Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces from himself to the President of the Government of National Unity. So essentially today, under the Government of National Stability, Fathi Bashagha is the soft face of Khalifa Haftar, who now controls the presidency under Aghala Saleh, the Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Finance and Planning. And essentially what you have is a civilian government, all but in name, whereas the key strategic posts of that government are controlled essentially by the military. So what you have, in essence, is really nothing to do with the elections, nothing to do with the constitution, an entirely weaponized process, and the end of really the UN's capabilities to really respond to the clear conflict in Libya, where there are irreconcilable differences. There are irreconcilable differences in the structures of these different military factions. Now, Fathi Bashagha, given that he was the Western strongman for 2 years in the former government, in theory, you would imagine that if the Western strongman has shaken hands with the Eastern strongman, there's no more war. I mean, that's what at least it would look like on paper. But today, Fathi Bashagha is unable to enter the capital, Tripoli, has lost complete representation of the forces in Western Libya, who are now almost a political constituency without a home or without a representative, but they have very clear and quite obvious demands. They don't want to see a military state. They don't want to see a state presided over by soft civilian faces that mask the military state or the institutions that would be controlled by a military under the guise of Khalifa Haftar. And that, for me, that fault line has yet to be addressed. And that is the fundamental reason why Libya's political process has failed, because it still starts in reality that over the last 8 years of political processes, beginning in Skhirat and Algeria in 2014, under the UN process in January 2020 in Berlin, and again, now we're facing maybe a third one under Stephanie Williams. The really obvious questions, and I started with a really obvious question: how do you characterize Libya's conflict? I still think it's almost a political culture war. Do you want to live under a civilian state where the military is a subservient instrument of the civilian state, or do you live in a state where the military controls the civilian apparatus and controls the state? And that question is really fundamental. It's also fundamental to the way in which we enter into peace dialogue, because you need to have representatives of both sides. It strikes me that the two sides of this conflict have never sat down. The GNA's forces, or the Government of National Unity's forces, or whatever acronym we come up with next to represent forces that were against Haftar, let's just call them anti-Haftar forces, they have never sat down on a table with the forces that represent Khalifa Haftar's forces. There is a 5+5 committee. I won't talk too much about that. Mustafa can have his remarks and comments on that, and I'll defer to him. But it strikes me that those two sides have never sat down, and they are in structures that are deeply, deeply irreconcilable. On the one hand, you have a structure that is deeply tribal. It's a patronage system that was designed first by Muammar al-Gaddafi in the mid-1990s, was reincarnated under Khalifa Haftar, under a tribal system that now he presides over, with a Praetorian guard that is guarded by his sons and a group of Salafi al-Madakhila that are in Eastern Libya. And that body, that system, that structure is so irreconcilable with the variety of armed groups, militias, community, city-state, tribal groups that might exist in Western Libya. But for the most part, the majority of those fighters only seem to emerge on the front lines, 100,000 plus, whenever the threat of military authoritarianism rears its head. And that is the reason why those phenomena, the phenomena that trigger to mobilize tens, 50,000, 60,000 forces on the ground, that's a mobilizer, that's a trigger, that's what brings this force to the streets in Libya, or in Western Libya. Those forces have never been represented in a military dialogue, and I think that's going to be a key issue in Mustafa's comments, which I won't grab from him. On the political level, the equivalent is still there. Whenever you find two individuals shaking hands or high-fiving or signing pieces of paper, they lose their representation of these groups that are still against Khalifa Haftar's Libyan Arab Armed Forces. And I think for that reason, all of the political processes are drawn around and are doing all of these political acrobatics to avoid calling things by their name. And so I think unless we have a UN process that addresses the structural asymmetries on both sides, the way in which these armed groups are structured and formed, you won't have an agreement to unify the military structures or to dismantle them or demobilize them. On the political level, if we continue with this, quite frankly, insulting to everyone's intelligence, Libyan agreement, we won't move forward. And I think on a third level, if we continue to establish structures that are zero-sum, like a presidential system, and we move away from a consensual system like a parliament, then I think we're going to continue with this zero-sum reality when Libyans need to forge consensus and probably need parliamentary elections first, if they even need presidential elections at all. But that's something that Libyans can decide for themselves or discuss amongst themselves. I won't speak on their behalf. But I think it's this absence of consensus, and the parliament is probably the first and the last place to discuss that. That's probably where we have to start. So I'm going to leave my comments there because there's a lot to cover. And unfortunately, I don't know, I've probably gone much longer than what I wanted to say. But I feel that there's a lot to capture in the history. So I've given my parting thoughts. I hope they were useful, and I'll hand it over to Rana. Thanks so much.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just waiting for my cue from Patrick. Would you like me to start?
Yes, Rana. Thank you very much.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this discussion. And thank you, Anas, for the very informative and helpful scene setting and political analysis that you've provided. So I shall focus on social policy and social protection issues. And in many ways, I think I just really welcome the invitation to speak at a meeting where the issues surrounding conflict have still not been resolved. And I want to thank the organizers of this meeting, because social policy is a key aspect of the peace building process. And certainly in these times, it's very useful to be able to discuss this. So I hope that people listening may not think that it's quite premature to think about social protection systems, how they've existed in Libya and how they could form part of a future peace building process. And that's really because elite level policymaking is always eventually reflected at the community level. And we know increasingly from a wider evidence throughout the world that even at the elite level, when peace settlements happen, if the community level grievances are not tackled, and if those inequalities and asymmetries at the elite level remain reflected at the local level, then the peace building process remains quite fragile. And certainly I think in Anas's introduction, there were references to inclusion and exclusion, and that the parties negotiating the peace process need to remain inclusive about the wider factions within Libya. And I think this sort of colleagues may already know, and everyone listening may already be familiar with some of these ideas. And certainly there's a general move, not just in the MENA region, but elsewhere, to link humanitarian processes with development processes, with peace development, that this is a continuum. And therefore we need to be clear at the time of these elite settlements about how those sort of the reconfiguration of power at that level translates practically into justice and social justice at the local level. And in a way, when we think about social policy and social protection, we are thinking practically about how the political configurations translate practically through institutions, through programs, into the community level, and therefore hopefully support a longer lasting peace process. So my comments will sort of be framed around this background and considering what we know about Libya now and perhaps the trajectory that the country has followed. And I'll just conclude with some recommendations if the time is appropriate for these in terms of what can be done and the role of social protection in thinking more long-term about peace building and the resolution of this link between conflict, development and humanitarianism. And hopefully, yeah, I will welcome some of your thoughts. So it will not come as a surprise, perhaps, that there is a lot of data lacking on Libya. I mean, I did a very quick check, or rather a recent check before this evening's call, and the World Bank itself does not have any data on poverty, or at least any updated data on poverty that I'm aware of. One citation from the Inclusive and Poverty Center and Inclusive Growth in Brazil cited the poverty rate at 14.4%, but that was in 2015. And there is quite an interesting set of indicators around Libya that perhaps give an unexpected picture about the country. One being that the rate of poverty at this time was actually lower than some other countries in the North African region or the wider Arab region. So against this background of lack of data about the social protection systems, I've tried to pull together what evidence there is to give a sense of the context currently in Libya and some of the issues that the country faces. Clearly, there's a lot of focus on children, and I think that reflects some of the agencies that are trying to fill the gaps in service provision, because social policy and social protection services are clearly very concerned with the delivery of services to the local population, particularly issues related to food and access to food and food security remain key. One paradox about Libya that I will refer to later on is that we may not necessarily expect certain levels of coverage to exist, perhaps in regimes that were not very inclusive. However, countries like Libya, or the irony of the MENA region in general, and we find this as well in the Syrian context, was that within sort of up to the mid-2010s, these were countries that had quite good provision of social security in comparison to the rest of their neighbors in the Arab context. And certainly this is one of the conundrums of the role of social protection services and programming, and perhaps reflect a certain element of politicization. I mean, we can't go into the details of this conversation here, but there is more to be said about the relationship between the type of political system that exists in low and middle income countries, if we put it that way, with the extensive provision and the coverage of citizens and their access to public services. And I will refer to this a little bit further down. So at sort of surface level nationally, Libya is a country that has a range of laws and policy actors very similar to other Arab-speaking countries in the MENA region. There are laws around social security, so marriage and divorce, basic assistance, persons with disabilities, child protection. And we also find that the country has the typical configuration of government bodies that are in charge of ensuring social protection to a range of citizens within the country. And in that sense, these are institutions that historically have had an important role to play in the country. And I would argue that any future peace settlement should take seriously at some point the role of these organizations and update these laws and think about their adaptability and suitability to ensure wide coverage within the country. Historically, so we're kind of sort of talking between the 1990s and up to 2015, which is where some of the data is available on the social protection system in Libya. We have free healthcare and education services in this country, which is not unusual, but of course the extent to which these are actively accessed by the population is another matter. But actually the data suggests that between the 1990s and up to the mid-2010s, the country was seeing good improvements on health indicators. And this was also the case for other countries in the region. I've mentioned Syria earlier, and perhaps one of the ironies of this debate around the type of political system that we have and the extent of coverage that we may have. So as an example, in Libya, between 1990 and 2015, under 5 mortality rates actually fell from 42 to 13 deaths per 1,000 live births. And in the same period, maternal mortality rates decreased from 39 to 9 per 100,000 live births. Now, of course, the intervention of international agencies may have well helped to support these improvements in health services, but just to kind of give a sense of the complexity of welfare indicators, you can see that there have been some improvements in this time period. Beyond health and education, there is little information available about the status and coverage rates of the key social protection programs. Usually we refer to contributory or non-contributory social protection schemes, whereby contributory schemes are employment-based social insurance type of programs, usually for private sector or public sector workers. And then non-contributory social protection programs tend to be those sort of cash assistance, social programs that will be targeting poor households and therefore really helping vulnerable groups. So there is very little information about these programs. There are a few reports, for example, again, by the IPCIG, that show the types of programs that Libya has, which again are quite similar to the rest of the region in terms of their emphasis on subsidies historically, or on unconditional cash transfers. But for example, other programs like school feeding have not existed. What is also striking historically about Libya is that spending on social protection was generally at a good level, so 4.4% of GDP around 2010. This was in comparison to the rest of the region. And in fact, it's a country that stands out as reaching a very high level of coverage rates of up to 87% in terms of social security provision, and benefits are paid on a contributory basis in the event of old age, disability, sickness, unemployment, injury, and pregnancy. And this level of coverage of the social security system is very good. I think further discussion needs to be done in terms of the share of public sector workers and private sector workers, and of course, the informal sector. But just to say historically that this is a country that has had a strong institutional base for social protection, and therefore, again, future plans for peace building and the reconstruction and the rebuilding of institutions hopefully can rebuild on the strong past that the country has had. As we'll expect, due to the conflict, humanitarian assistance programs have played and continue to play a crucial role in providing essential goods and services, whilst most services are provided as temporary benefits to alleviate the impacts of the current crisis. A few initiatives are already trying to integrate themselves into the existing efforts to stabilize the country and therefore to transition into national authorities. And this is particularly relevant to food security issues, and the World Food Programme is especially active in Libya. So for example, it delivers food baskets to food insecure individuals as identified in the 2015 Libya multi-sectoral needs assessment. The WFP is considering the possibility of transforming this humanitarian service into a cash and voucher scheme, and to include it in the national social safety net once this is operational again. Yes, so it's already thinking about how we transition from the humanitarian approach to social protection to a more institutionalized, long-term, nationalized system. This has not happened yet due to security risks, and there is still limited data on food availability and the fluctuating prices in the local markets. And of course, this transition between humanitarian crisis to stabilization and recovery is really essential for the sustainability of social protection systems in Libya. And of course, is one of the reasons why, not just in Libya, but elsewhere in conflict-affected countries and in the MENA region, there is increasing interest to understand how social protection systems operate in the country. And certainly, is very modestly someone who's worked on social policy issues in the Middle East since the year 2000. I think there is absolutely a trend in this regard. If I may share, I suppose, my personal comment, and in a way, the shame is that we've had to wait for crises to happen, whether it's the Arab Spring or whether it's particular war situations, or more recently, the COVID pandemic, in order for policymakers to gain greater attention or to show greater attention to the importance of social protection systems in supporting political stability, provided that they are inclusive and that they do genuinely extend social rights in an egalitarian manner across the national territory. So in the Libyan context, the Social Solidarity Fund and the Ministry of Social Affairs are very much the main implementers of the state-led social assistance effort that's supporting vulnerable people in Libya. These programs seem to be quite significant and critical. However, there is still very scant information with regards to their scope, their status, and the coverage of their social protection programs. And therefore, to advocate for reform and help expand the coverage of these existing programs and strengthen the linkages with current humanitarian efforts, there is a need for a more precise understanding of the legal framework behind social protection. So the laws that I referred to earlier on, which after hopefully an effective peace settlement at the elite level, can lead to revisiting that legislation and updating it as necessary. And as well, there are other issues to consider in terms of the management and implementation of current social protection programs. No doubt the population will have changed, the needs will have changed, and therefore programs need to be able to adapt to the context within the country. I'll just mention also the really key subsidies, because these are really important throughout the region. So food, fuel, and energy subsidies were adopted in Libya in the 1970s, and the subsidies are more or less the only universal type of program we find in most Arab countries, and Libya is also an example. And the process of subsidy reforms, as I'm sure everybody knows, happened in the early 2000s, around 2005 to 2010. And with the outbreak of the revolution, these reforms were rolled back almost entirely. In 2015, however, a lack of funds led to the de facto removal of the food subsidies. And this, of course, has exacerbated the problem of food shortages and has led to a substantial increase in food prices in the country. And despite the removal of food subsidies, spending on fuel and energy subsidies remains high and is estimated at around 12.5% of GDP. And this is according to data, which is again a little bit out of date. So this was data from 2016, according to World Bank sources. Another distinctive feature in terms of the universalism in Libya is that in fact, Libya has been historically the only country in the region, in the MENA region, with a universal child allowance. So there is a law, which is law number 27 of 2013, that stipulates a family allowance of 100 Libyan dinars per month. I believe it's dinars in Libya, I hope that's correct, which is paid by the Ministry of Social Affairs to all children under 18 and to single women who have no salary or wage. And in this, I have to say, when I wasn't aware of this myself, I mean, a lot of countries talk about a universal child benefit now as one way of alleviating the poverty issues and the squeeze on livelihoods and family and households in the MENA region. And I think that this is quite an important aspect of Libya's social protection institutions, which would be worth, again, perhaps integrating into the future peace building plans. So I think really just to kind of conclude and sort of give some recommendations, if I may. There is clearly a lack of data, and this represents a challenge in assessing Libya's social protection system and the extent to which it reaches all vulnerable populations around the country. And of course, due to the current security situation, the political instability, many national service provision systems have become dysfunctional, and therefore, emphasizing the need for humanitarian programs. In the medium term, it will be important to integrate these humanitarian programs into the national social protection system, such as the food baskets provided by the World Food Programme. And given the severe consequences of the conflict on vulnerable groups' well-being, it will also be important to focus on introducing social protection programs that are sensitive to specific vulnerable groups. So children, for example, will likely be the top priority in this effort. And as we know, the food insecurity issue remains pivotal for Libya, and therefore really critical that any sort of strategic plans that the ruling parties begin to develop will need to really take into account these factors. In terms of sort of recommendations, there's a lot that we can do, but I will kind of focus on what is relevant for social protection, and perhaps in the medium term, following the sort of some sense of political stability in the country, certainly at elite level. We need to begin with an effort to collect data and understand the population, and to disaggregate this information by gender and age, and very often data is missing across this region. So some very basic updating of knowledge about the country is needed. And there will also be a need to continue with this regular collection of data and undertaking poverty studies specifically to understand how households are coping, and how they are dealing in the recovery period. In terms of the range of programs that are available, there will be a need to rethink and revisit both contributory and non-contributory programs in the country. Certainly where there is any targeting, there will be a need to rethink the targeting mechanisms and ensure that the population that is vulnerable and in need is covered in some ways, in relevant ways, and therefore that may require an expansion of the existing system in order to be able to deal with the needs that are arising. I will end just by saying that historically, war has been a major trigger for the expansion of state-led social protection systems. And the Second World War changed Europe completely, and it was the moment where we have the birth in effect of welfare states in Western Europe. And in that sense, sadly, war is that context in which societies could potentially come together, and where social protection systems, the value of them is felt even more. And certainly crises are another example, and the COVID pandemic was also another moment when a lot of Arabic governments clearly responded and had that reflexive effect. But what we need more in the Arab countries is a lot more of the future planning for social protection and the strengthening, institutional strengthening of social protection. What we don't want are reactive systems that deal to crises and seek to manage crises through targeted cash transfers, but rather what we need are institutions that have a better resilience, better shock responsiveness measures. And in that sense, these are systems that need to be inclusive and comprehensive. Where do we bring the resources from? This is obviously not the question to discuss in my presentation, but I can certainly allude to some factors. And one very basic element is that the expansion of work opportunities and the development of a functioning taxation system is one very basic way in which the social protection system can self-fund itself, and through the adoption of a life cycle approach to social protection, then I think the peace building effort can incorporate an inclusive and justice-oriented understanding of peace, rather than just the sort of the settlement of reaching political stability, because we can have political stability, but whether that political stability is what we call positive peace rather than a negative peace is something else to consider, and hence why the peace building process needs to incorporate considerations of inclusive social protection systems from the start. Thank you so much. I may have also overrun a little bit.
Thank you very much, Rana. And Mustafa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Happy to be part of this event on Libya. I would just like to give a background on the establishment of the Libyan state, that we know now with its geography. Libya was established in 1951 as a constitutional monarchy. The constitution that was drafted in 1951 is a very unique constitution, a constitution where we had a king, we had two houses of parliament, and we had an executive body, prime minister, and a government that had quite strong executive power. Separation of power in the constitution was very clear. Libya at that time in 1951 was one of the poorest countries in the region. The start of producing oil started in mid-60s, or let's say maybe early 60s. But before that, Libya was coming out from wars, the war against Italy and the resistance against the Italian colonialization, then World War II that took place in Libya. All of you know Tobruk and you know the war between the Germans and the Allies in Libya that went on for many years. So establishing Libya and building the Libyan institutions, the United Kingdom of Libya, as it started in 1951, was a process that was started by King Idris and his, we call them founding fathers, plus the support of the UN and let's say a few countries like the UK and other countries that supported Libya in building its new institutions, administrations, government. Libya started as a federal state with 3 states: Cyrenaica, Tripolitania, and Fezzan. King Idris tried in these 18 years that he ruled Libya, he tried to establish the Libyan identity. Libya was not called an Arab state, it was called United Kingdom of Libya, because King Idris from the beginning thought that there is diversity in Libya. We had Arabs, we had Amazirs, we had people from African origin, plus Libya had minorities from Greece, from Malta. It had diversity. We had different religions, majority, of course, vast majority Muslims, Sunni Muslims, but we also had a minority of Jews and Christians. So during these 18 years, state building process, institution building process took place. If you go back to the old photographs of Libya, its streets, schools, educational system, hospitals were being built. And when the oil was produced in the 60s and started to be exported abroad, huge projects, development projects were planned and established by King Idris and the governments that took place at the time. And I would like to give this background just to put you in the historic context, how the modern Libya started, how it was going on a path of state building, institution building, development, building the Libyan army, the Libyan police, the health sector, education, and many universities were built in the late 60s. In 1963, Libya changed from, there was a constitutional amendment where it was changed from a federal state to a united state. So that even the name was changed from United Kingdom of Libya to the Kingdom of Libya. In 1961, we had the coup d'etat that was conducted by Gaddafi and another 11 officers, young officers that conducted a coup d'etat and decided to freeze the constitution and establish a republic. They called it the Libyan Arab Republic until 1973, when Gaddafi actually got rid of most of his companions and took control of all powers, and he established his own state, and later on he called it Al-Jamahiriya, and he had his green book as the constitution and started meddling. What's really dangerous that he started meddling with the Libyan identity. So for the first decade of his rule, Libya was an Arab state, mostly, following the path of Jamal Abdel Nasser, where he completely ignored that Libya had diversity. We have the Amazigh, we have the, Tabu, we have the Tuareg, there was diversity. He completely ignored it, and he decided that Libya is an Arab state, part of this pan-Arab unity for about 10 to 15 years. And then he decided that no, Libya was an African state, pan-African, and he decided that he's the king of kings of Africa and so on. So he started changing the identity of Libya and transforming it to an identity that he controlled. So everything was linked to Gaddafi, his green book. Even he changed the flag, he changed the national anthem. And during this period of time, of course, many changes happened to the institutions, including the security sector, where he decided that instead of having an army, he was worried that maybe another coup d'etat that would be done against him, because there were many different military groups at the time that committed failed coup d'etats. So he decided to transfer the army instead of the official army with its ranks to an army that he called the People's Army. That we, as young people, as kids in schools, we had to learn how to use arms and be part of this People's Army, where you had, kids in high schools, and you had, old people had to carry arms and to be trained to be part of this People's Army. So meddling and dismantling of the institutions in general, including the security sector, started during Gaddafi's period, late 70s, 80s, and it continued. Of course, as you all know, in 2011, when the Libyan people decided to revolt after 42 years of this corrupted system, of this dictatorship, we were lucky that we got rid of Gaddafi's system, his regime, but of course we inherited many challenges. Part of these challenges are failed institutions. Part of these challenges, by the time after 42 years, we had to struggle on rebuilding our identity again. Our identity was linked to Gaddafi, to his thoughts, to his adventures. So this is another challenge, how to rebuild the Libyan identity, how to, again, build this texture of Libyan diversity, East, West, Cyrenaica, Fezzan, Tripolitania. And I can say the biggest challenge that we face is how to rebuild our security sector and the institutions that we needed to secure our country, protect the people, and bring stability. The other challenge that we faced was the spread of arms. During the revolution, I myself was part of the revolutionaries. I entered many different camps and depots that were in different parts of Libya, and it was really amazing on the huge number of different weapons that we found in the different camps and depots. Some say around 20 pieces of arms were left by Gaddafi. And these arms, of course, when the regime failed, they spread amongst the people, amongst young people, tribes, regions, some even criminal groups, some radical groups. So the spread of arms led to the spread of militias and armed groups. So the challenge since 2011 was how to rebuild our security sector institutions and how to demobilize these groups, the newly formed, either tribal, regional, radical, revolutionary groups, how to demobilize them, how to organize the arms or disarm, and how to build new security apparatus, new army, an army that is under civilian control, an army that does not interfere into politics, an army and a police sector or a security sector that protects the people, a security sector that does not have the same characteristics of the old security sector of Gaddafi. That was one of the main reasons that the people revolted against Gaddafi's regime, was the oppression of the security sector, the torture in prisons, the oppressive system that was led by Gaddafi. So these are the challenges that we faced after 2011, 12, 13, 14. In 2013, and actually in February 2013, Khalifa Haftar started calling for a military rule. He had a coup d'etat in Tripoli that failed. Then he decided to move to Benghazi, actually in 2014, February 2014, and then he started his so-called war against terrorism in Benghazi in mid-2014. And then we faced the new dilemma. We have a military leader who gathered some military officers and committed this coup d'etat in order to have control over the country. And he linked it to his political agenda and trying to control Libya under his command. So this is the situation we are facing. We are facing a military leader claiming that he leads an army, even though this army has proved that it is worse than militias and military groups and even criminal groups. It has committed many war crimes in the east, in the west, and also in the south of Libya. And we have these militias. Some of them are revolutionary militias, some of them are criminals, some of them are even radical militias. We are facing this situation in our security sector. What is the solution? In my opinion, the solution and the roadmap to overcome this challenge is, first of all, to have a plan for a security sector reform. we need to rebuild new institutions, police sector, military, army, intelligence. There has been some studies, there have been some trials by the UN, like the white paper that was written in 2013 towards a white paper, a roadmap for rebuilding the Libyan army. We need to have our DDR program, DDR meaning demobilizing, disarming, and reintegrating militia members as individuals by maybe some of them can join the army and the police and the security apparatus if they fit the criteria. Some or the majority should have another path of maybe having their own private businesses, small businesses, entrepreneurship, education, vocational training, and so on. Unfortunately, in the UN dialogue, neither in Khairat nor in Geneva, these plans of security sector reform or DDR have not been included in the agenda of the governments that were installed. And until this day, they have not been included in any of the agendas of the HOR, nor the United Nations plans in Libya. So in my opinion, Libya needs a clear plan for DDR, security sector reform, and inclusivity of these military groups, militias, revolutionary groups. They need to be included in the political process, because at the end, they are the ones on the ground that have the decision, the final decision on protecting any agreement that is negotiated between politicians. This is from my side. I think this is the real challenge we are facing in Libya. It needs to be addressed. And if it is not addressed, then no matter what political dialogue we have or political agreement we have, it will not succeed unless we address this challenge of security sector reform and DDR. Thank you.
Very much, Mustafa. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And Patrick, could you transfer Anas to participant? He's on as a listener at the moment. I think he's transferred to if you could make him a participant, then I can engage him in the questions as well. But until I've done that, Rana, you've talked about the division between the people and the political elite, and you've talked about public services, health, and so forth. It seems to me very often what's missing in Libya is a vocal and engaged and empowered civil society. So how can Libya build a civil society?
Okay, so the issue with civil society is that it needs to be autonomous and spontaneous. And what we see in countries that have monarchies or that have strong centralized systems, so I hope it's okay to name them, yeah, from the research point of view. So the Arab Gulf states, Morocco, Jordan, and more so Egypt, and I think to a certain extent Syria, is that civil society is very controlled by the state. And it's a major issue across this region. So we have paradoxical situations in countries like the monarchies, like Morocco, Jordan, Arab Gulf states, where the government itself has actively tried to develop civil society, even Iran as well, if you look beyond the Arab world. So there is this idea, so these organizations become, so civil society groups become sort of parastate organizations, and you haven't got real independence in this sense. And I think that these are historical factors that kind of go back a long time. I mean, certain countries, Jordan, Morocco, have sort of diverged a little bit, and that there is an active more active civil society base, but then you have strong patronage from the royal families. And I think what's important is that you need to have an independent education system. You need to have laws that allow freedom of association and allow opposition, and therefore the building of an independent civil society sector. Now, in some ways, civil society can also sprout from the extensive philanthropic, sometimes also tribal, religious, traditional forms of association in all of these countries. And I mean, I believe, yes, so through research and not just in this region, but historically in other parts of the world, an independent and perhaps civic civil society can emerge from these more ascribed types of identities. Yeah, and I mean, I know in Lebanon, for example, there is this distinction between a civic society, mujtama madani, and then a civil society that's based more on ascribed identity, so mujtama ahli. And I think any kind of freedom of association, independent of the state, needs to happen through legislation, through an education system that supports critical thinking and supports political thinking as well. And I mean, and it's interesting that in the countries that haven't got an active civil society base, these are countries where citizens voluntarily avoid speaking about politics and self-censor themselves.
Okay, thank you, Rana. I'm afraid we've only got 20 minutes left, and I could ask any of the participants who want to ask a question to put it in the Q&A. And I've got a couple of questions myself, which I want to put as part of this moderated discussion to both Anas and to Mustafa. But if we have time, I'll try and get round to your questions as well. But Anas, you gave us a very good summary of the political situation, political dilemmas facing the Libyans and the international community at the moment. If you were advising Stephanie Williams and international community in both Tripoli and in Tunis, how can they help to bring this elusive stability, given that the UN, as the one hand, has said, it's up to you, the Libyans, but the political elite, as you've rightly described, don't want to go down the route of elections. How would you advise Stephanie to go forward?
I think you put your finger on the button there, Peter. I think it's really important to remember that the greatest irony here is that there is an expectance and almost a reliance and responsibility on the part of the actors not only responsible for much of the conflict, including individuals like Khalifa Haftar and Agila Saleh, but also those that have strangled and throttled democracy for several years now, refusing to allow for elections to take place beyond these last 8 months, but going on for the last 8 years, and have, like I said, they throttled democracy and expecting them somehow to show some kind of, I can't even find the word, so excuse me. What I'm trying to find the word really is that you expect them to demonstrate some sort of self-sacrifice, to give up their positions and institutions and allow for the political transition to take place. Now, if you keep giving those responsible and rewarding them with the ability to do so, the ability to decide and saying, well, let's let the Libyans decide. Let's be quite frank, when we're talking about Libyans, we're talking about no more than 10 individuals now that have throttled the democratic transition and the state building process for several years. We're expecting them to change track. I don't believe that they will, and I think that there needs to be a plan B, essentially, to force through the transition without hoping that one of these individuals or individuals that presides over an institution will then demonstrate self-sacrifice or change their mind. There's much to be won in this conflict, and that's a major problem here. That's the first. I would say that the real, if I was to advise, or if I was to be put in that position, the first thing that I would say is don't lose sight of the fact that this is more than just about elections. Think about the day after the elections. What kind of state are fresh political candidates or refreshed political candidates, as we probably have seen in the last several years? What kind of state would they preside over? Is it going to be a divided state with divided military factions, and divided economic institutions, and fractured political institutions at best? Where, in March of last year, we said there was a unified government and we only have one government. That's fair, but Prime Minister Dbeiba couldn't land his plane in Benghazi last year. So it tells you much about what the idea of unity really means. It's all good and well saying it on paper, but in reality, I think they need to start seriously considering sanctioning individuals that have throttled that process and not removing them when they feel like it's politically expedient. I mean, we should remember that Agela Saleh was sanctioned by the European Union, and then for no reason at all, it begs the question why. Not only why, but also the timing. Several months before the beginning of the LPDF, he was removed from sanctions, and it remains a mystery as to why. So sanctions, I think, should be on the table, number one. Number two, I think we need to look and remember that this is about a state-building process that began in January 2020, and that they shouldn't be devolving power of a state-building process under the emblem of the UN, but also the German government's emblem, and handing that over to actors that are also responsible for the conflict and are not impartial, honest brokers. I mean, the one that really runs to mind today is Egypt, that Egypt should not be responsible for Libya's military portfolio under the UN's emblem or the Berlin process emblem. They've throttled that process. They've made no ambition to actually unify or to work on this DDR process that Mustafa was explaining earlier on. So I think they need to start understanding that they have delegated responsibility to actors that act truly irresponsibly, and that they need to centralize that process. And I think centralizing that process means to have an actual security dialogue between the actors that are powerful on the ground, that would include individuals and groups that are in Eastern Libya and in Western Libya and in Southern Libya, and listen to what their fears are. And I think if they have an honest dialogue, at the very least, they'll come to some form of consensus about moving forward, because there is fatigue at the sub-national level. There are fatiguing groups that have been fighting for several years. I don't believe that fatigue means that they wouldn't go back to war. There's certainly been appetite if they feel threatened or that they're facing an existential threat. And before that happens, because if it does happen and there is another conflict, we're going to lose a valuable opportunity for mediation. And it certainly couldn't have been done by Jan Kubiš. He lost the faith of not only national actors, but sub-national actors. And Stephanie would risk losing risk the same fate if a new conflict was to emerge and there was ambivalence on the part of the UN Security Council, not because of ambivalence on Stephanie Williams' side, but on as I said earlier on, the divisions that are already there in the UN Security Council with Russia's position and the US position. So to come down to it, I think they need to remember that there's a state building process. And why it's so interesting is it's not disconnected from the fundamental question. The groups that would go back to conflict, they're the elephant in the room. You can't expect individuals like Khalifa Haftar, who has threatened to go back to war several times despite the ceasefire, has punched holes in that ceasefire for the last year. If you dismantle the armed forces that are under his control and in the west of Libya as well, without exception, southern Libya as well, then at the very least we start working within from conflict, because the very groups that would start war would end up being involved in a process that would stop it. Secondly, we remove ourselves from the fate of individuals and spoilers using their leverage or their threat of force when they won't have it anymore. So I think that's really clear that we have to do that. And thirdly, I think, as I said earlier on at the beginning of this, they need to think about moving forward within a timeline that is not based on individual dates, but based on milestones. There are key milestones that need to happen. The constitutional process is not a spoiling tactic, and it could become a spoiling tactic on the part of groups, the judiciary, the election law. We've already seen these things, but a country can't survive without a constitution. It needs one. And I think they need to give that serious consideration and not give that responsibility to actors. So I would say moving unilaterally forward, and probably at this stage, thinking quite creatively and out of the box, and potentially, even though it sounds quite crazy at this point, establishing a third body, a body that is not partisan or partial or done through this stupid muhassasa system that allows for the conflict to emerge under the guise of east, west, and south, a little bit of this, a little bit. I don't believe in any of that stuff. It's an absolute myth. If it was the case, as I said earlier on, then Libya would have already solved its problems, not when it had an east, west, south presidency, but when it had a 9-man presidency in 2015. That's a myth. We know what the clear problems are, and they can solve it if they want to, but they have to address these power centers, dismantle them, and move them and facilitate them forward through a state building process. That would be my solution.
Thank you, Anas. Mustafa, Anas has mentioned the ceasefire, and the ceasefire, at least between the main forces in the middle of the country, is holding. But you mentioned militias in Tripoli, Misrata, and Zawiya, and elsewhere. Is there a risk of war? Should we be worried about conflict?
I think, as Anas has said, you know, people, you know, most of these groups have had enough wars, and they're looking forward to something better. They're, you know, tired of, you know, since 2014, you know, we had Fajr Libya, we had Shuruk, we had the war, Bunya al-Marsus against Daesh. We had the war on Tripoli that, you know, just ended, you know, in 2020. So there is no appetite for a new war. But of course, if they, you know, they fear that, like the plan that Haftar, you know, might have for them, and that is just not only dismantling these militias or these armed groups, but considering them as terrorist groups, as his so-called LNA, Libyan National Army, is the official and legitimate army, and them are outlaws. This is, you know, how Haftar likes to talk about the militias in the Western region. Of course, if this threat is there, they will defend themselves. They will defend themselves. But again, the solution is how to integrate them, how to build a security sector that can be reformed. And there are many international expertise in this area. You know, many countries went through their DDR program, security sector reform. Actually, one of our attendees here is Timothy Reed. I can see his name. He was the head of security sector reform in DDR in Libya, the head of the UN SSR and DDR in Libya, and he was part of the towards a white paper. So there could be plans to solve this issue of militias, but you cannot resolve the issue of militias and have your DDR program unless you convince these militias that there will be an institution that represents the army, the police, that is accepted by all Libyans. You cannot have an institution like the one that Haftar wants to enforce on Libyan people, that is led by his sons and his tribe. This, of course, they will not be ready to disarm or, you know, to reintegrate or demobilize.
And Mustafa, there's a question here about Libyan weapons that have flowed south into the Sahel, used by arms groups there. What's the danger of that risk flowing back into Libya?
Of course, the danger is there, but I think we have enough weapons, so yeah. There is no real, it will not change the...
Despite the arms embargo, there's no shortage of weapons.
Yeah, there is no shortage of weapons, unfortunately.
And Rana, I don't know whether you've seen this question from Timothy Reed, but I think it's an important one about
yes,
the sources of division and governance. And it's something that I used to hear very often, is this vague concept about the fair distribution of wealth. You know, we've got most of the oil, but we don't get most of the money. I think that's a bit of a myth as well. But how can you convince people to share the resources rather than want to take control themselves of the resources? Have you got any magic wand for that one?
Gosh, yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, thank you. I saw that. And obviously, I mean, you know, there are countries that have used oil in Scandinavia and elsewhere in a fair way to support the society as a whole. And that's a political decision. Yeah. And with so many things, it's a political decision. Poverty is a political decision. Yeah, is a political problem. So I think, you know, without sounding too grim, I think what we always find in a lot of Arab countries is we're kind of faced, or we're told that what we're facing is a stark choice between authoritarianism or chaos. And it's as if that, you know, Arab populations cannot handle political differences and cannot tolerate political difference. And I think that this is an issue that needs to be not just investigated because it's an issue that we live, yeah, but clearly it needs to be dealt with. And I think, you know, your question about civil society earlier, Peter, is about the need to tolerate difference and the need to understand that, you know, we can live with difference without, you know, taking out arms against each other. So I think the oil issue is key. I mean, a big question will be how dependent the economy is on oil. And therefore, that is where the stakes are higher for the state to control that oil revenue in a more monopolized fashion. And I think, and I did refer to job creation and a functioning taxation system, because oil is the enemy, sadly, of a functioning taxation system. And there is a high risk, therefore, of going to this old system of a distributive state rather than a productive state.
Rana, I've got one last question for Anas, but I think both your comment there on the economy and Mustafa's comment on the militias, one of the mistakes that's been made by the international community in Libya is to regard the political track as a track by itself. Whereas you can't solve the military track by itself, you need to integrate the political, the security, and the economic, because they're all interlinked. You can't, as Mustafa said, you can't solve the problem of the militias without a political settlement. You can't solve the problem of the distribution of oil wealth without a proper unified government. So that's something that I think the international community needs to learn. But Anas, can I just link before we finish to the other big issue of the day? Is there a you yourself mentioned about the divisions in the Security Council, but apart from that, there are the Wagner mercenaries, the Russian forces on the ground in Libya. There's talk about Russians going from Libya back to Ukraine. What is the connection, if any, between Libya and Ukraine at the moment, as you see it? Oh, has he gone? Sorry, he's just texted me to say he's losing his connection.
Mr. Peter, can I just give you a piece of information?
Can you answer that for us, Mustafa?
I just, you know, I can give a piece of information that in the last 2 weeks, two of Khalifa Haftar's sons, colonels in his army, traveled to Moscow, and of course, you know, there is, you know, Wagner are working close to Haftar. They were his, you know, they were his main forces in attacking Tripoli in 2020, and him taking control in the south is through the Wagner mercenaries. So this might be something. I've heard a lot of rumors that forces are leaving from Libya to support Russia, like what's happening with some of these Syrian forces linked to Assad. But actually, there are no proofs of that, you know, Libyans are leaving. But I think some of the Wagners have left some of their posts in the south of Libya, and most probably to support the Russian army in Ukraine. So this is the information that we have, you know, between Libya and what's going on in Ukraine.
Thank you, Mustafa. And I'm not sure if Anas is back, but I think, Patrick, I'll pass back to you now.
Thank you very much, Peter. And of course, thank you very much to all of you who joined us at this panel this evening, especially Anas, who joined last minute. And of course, he's based in Libya right now, and he mentioned that connection might be erratic. Thank you very much for all of your useful discussion. I'm sure we could continue this for hours. And I want to draw the attendees' attention to our upcoming events, which you can find on our website as well as on our social media platforms. We also have a mailing list that you can sign up for to keep up to date with ongoing events. And once again, I thank our exceptional panel, Dr. Rana, Jawad, Mustafa, Sagezli, and Ambassador Peter Millett for making an incredibly informative discussion this evening. Thank you all, and I really do hope that in the future we can host you in Cambridge in person.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.